Now, are there questions for our panellists from the floor? There are microphones around. Who would like to be first? John.
Yeah, John Ballard, Water New Zealand. The questions are being, we've heard it from anti-day economic regulation. What is it about your model that stops you gouging your ratepayers or customers' pockets or excess profits? Can you tell us a bit about that? Because you seem to be operating in an environment where there isn't any specific economic regulation.
Yes, that's a good question. So, from my shareholders' point of view, they would love us to keep increasing our prices because it helps them with their debt to revenue ratio, right? So the push from the shareholder is make the prices higher. If we increase the price, the board's point of view, and don't underestimate the role of the board because they're independent and it's a company and they're very prudent and responsible. So from their point of view, they are very conscious of the fact that if we had more money, what would we do with the money? And so management could get fat. So management would start spending money where they don't need. That's one scenario. Or would start spending the money on something else. So currently, the regulator for us is the board. It's the board and the directors on the board. The directors on the board who are very conscious of the fact that we need to make sure we've got the intergenerational issues right. Then when we get the mayor's letter of expectation on which we build our statement of intent, there is an indication there as to what the mayor may be looking for. And in this case, Mayor Goff, when he was campaigning, he was looking for keeping rates down at 2.5%. So there's a signal there to Watercare that if rates are supposed to be down at 2.5%, then the expectation is that the water charges will also be down at 2.5%. So that would be my response. But yeah, I'm not saying that we don't need a regulator. That's a different question.
Question.
Brent Gilpin from ESR. A question for Mike. You mentioned health-based targets. I was wondering if you could expand on what sort of health-based targets you are trying to manage towards or achieve.
Yeah, so this is a relatively recent concept for us. I probably cut over very quickly on my comment around boil water alerts, and this is probably will help explain it a little bit. If I look at all the towns in our state that are on boil water alerts, at least I know every customer has a notice that says don't drink the water. Right? And so that gets a lot of focus, but I can at least know if they choose to drink the water when we've issued a boil water notice, at least they're making a choice and we've informed them. My big concern, and this goes to where health-based targets take you, is the people that are drinking water from systems where we don't have adequate barriers. So an example of that for us might be, when it rains heavily, we get highly turbid water, chlorine's not effective, and all we've got is chlorine as protection and in terms of the raw water source. So the turbidity going out the door becomes high, E. coli, other bacteria can stay with the particles and people get sick. And what can we do about it without investing in increasing the number of barriers? So health-based targets, and it's not the only thing I look at, but health-based targets have basically look at the potential for someone to get ill, right? So, and the effectiveness, and the response to that is the effectiveness of your barriers. One of those is, I just talked about capital barriers, so in other words, what investment do you have to make to put in physical barriers to ensure that when it rains heavily and you start getting very highly turbid waters, you've got systems that protect against that. The other component, so we use a matrix approach, is you can have the best systems in the world. That's all great, you can have invested, but you run your plants poorly. And people still get sick. And so what the health-based targets does, and what we use it for, is to, it's very well defined to say, Are we managing them well? Do we use best practice in terms of operating our plants? So we sort of use a matrix approach. And do we have adequate barriers? And when those two things are working well together, then the probability of someone getting sick when an unusual event occurs is very low. You know, I can have, in our business, we could have invested heavily in all these upgrades, putting all these new barriers in, but we don't train our operators. We don't invest in good operations. I might as well have not done any of it. So the health-based targets for us is a step beyond the current Australian Drinking Water Guidelines, which is focused on the probability of someone getting ill, or the population getting ill, and how we in effect reach those levels that are set internationally. That's in effect where we're going. So probability of based approach, you can look it up. I'm sure Marcus can give you a lot of detail. They use a measure called DALYs from recollection, daily adjusted life, I think it is. So that's where we're coming from. So we've got that's the focus, the journey we're on over the next 3 years. And so we're looking at both those things. We're saying what's wrong with our operating practices and where do we need to invest so that I can get the same tune Marcus sleep at night.
I'm going to ask one now. Marcus, should technical regulations such as drinking water regulation be bundled with economic regulation, or should they remain separate as I understand is the case of the United Kingdom?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question because it has been a topic that's been asked not once certainly in England and Wales, but in fact about 3 times, and it keeps getting asked, the same question keeps getting asked, is it the right place? Often what happens is that somebody comes along and says, well, you know, this drinking water inspectorate, you know, they're kind of out there on their own and they're sort of making their own decisions, you know, they're a loose cannon, or could be a loose cannon, and should we bundle them up with somebody else? And we have a rather complex number of regulators, and I think water in England and Wales is one of the most regulated industries. It has financial regulators, environmental regulators, regulators for the customers, water quality regulators. There's an involvement from Public Health England, local authorities, and even DEFRA from a policy and emergency. So you can see that it's quite confused. The problem for us, I think, is that when you're thinking about water quality, that's your primary concern. You have to be absolutely focused on water quality and protecting public health. When you're bundled up in the economic regulation, there may be a board, and if you're deciding to take a prosecution, the board might say, well, is this the right thing to do? Should we prosecute? It might cost the company £85 million, and we'd rather you wouldn't do that. And if you have a board that's governing you, that might dissuade you out of taking the action that is the right course of action. Similarly, if you're thinking about putting it into an environmental regulator, the scenario I might paint there is a situation where there's been an environmental pollution event. You carry out an investigation, you discover that the pollution's occurred because it's above a consent level, and you want to take to prosecute the company because the company at the end of the day has to risk assess what's in the source water, understand that, mitigate it, and then protect the public health, primary concern. I keep saying that. And if it turns out that the environmental regulator has licensed that consent, actually then you could be in a position that that regulator is culpable. Now, one of the things that we do is we work under the Police and Criminal Evidence Act, and we want to investigate and we want to question people. So it's very difficult to question yourself, and there's a conflict of interest there. So you can't do that if you're a financial regulator. Let's say also the financial regulator wants to restrict spending. It's absolutely, I mean, I thought the last presentation was a wonderful summary of financial regulation, and we work exactly that model in England and in Scotland as well. Sorry?
We work your model too.
Oh, yes. And, you know, I've lost my train of thought there. But, you know, we do want to make sure that the financial regulators are not in a position that they have to make a decision to cut back or ask for efficiencies. And then the company turns around and says, well, the economic regulator has asked for efficiencies, and that efficiency is realised as cutting staff back who have knowledge and expertise. And the company says, well, that's what the regulator says to us, you can't prosecute us. So by being an independent body, the company doesn't have that defence. And you can then decide purely on technical grounds, were the company reckless, were they negligent? In fact, I've just prosecuted a company for being reckless, because what happened there is they had a contract with a supermarket actually. They wanted to build a supermarket on a site, and they needed to divert a mains around it. So they'd done all the plans, all the engineering and everything, and they came along to do it, dug out the hole, realised actually the mains wasn't quite what they expected it to be. God, they're under pressure now, because if they don't do the main, they're going to get fined for serviceability, etc. And they're also going to get fined by the contractor and the supermarket and whatnot. So they go ahead with the work, irrespective. And they try to cap off the supply, don't have the right equipment, and then during the night it blows. And it floods the M27, I don't know if you know, which is the minor road in the south of England, brings the south of England to a standstill. And we took them to court because what they had done is they'd ignored the engineering drawings, they hadn't risk assessed. When they discovered it was different, they didn't change it. So consequently, the judge agreed with us. They said they were reckless. First time we got someone for reckless on that, and it's because we could make that decision. And more important, because I made the decision to make that prosecution, it's the right decision. I don't think it's the right decision I made. But what I mean is that it's uninfluenced by somebody ringing up and saying, do you really want to take that prosecution? Do you really want to do that? Or maybe there's another alternative. I hope it's answering that.
But Anton, can I get your perspective on that? You're the economist, all right? Would you agree with bundling or not?
Economists love trade-offs, right? So I think what I'd like to add to that is I think, so when you're talking about technical regulation in the form of setting absolute minimum standards that we don't want to make a trade-off on, right? Don't want anybody getting massively sick or dying because they drink water. So there are certain standards that you want to set. There isn't a trade-off to be made, or at least we've decided it's not a trade-off that we want to make. I think for those instances, there's absolutely no reason why you'd want to have the economic regulator involved in it. I think it's a very different skill set. Just like you generally don't have economic regulators in electricity or gas setting the safety standards for working around high voltage lines or around pipes that could explode. The second you're into trade-off territory, and this is kind of where I think it gets interesting. Once again, if there is no trade-off to be made, and every single breach of a safety rate is something that you should prosecute because it's absolutely important, and you want to make a big example every time something happens, I think we're good. In a situation where there's a bit of discretion and you are thinking about, well, what does it ultimately cost customers? Because ultimately the customer pays. What should the target be? For example, I have a minimum reliability standard, but I can make it better. Or I'm currently well above it, I could probably make things worse and save a lot of money. In that instance, you do need an economic regulator involved to try and figure out, well, what are the customers willing to pay? What do they want to pay? What kind of service level do they want? Not the minimum safety standard, but what is the level of quality they want? Do they want to call their water utility and have the phone picked up in 30 seconds and have the connection in 2 days? Or can they wait for a week? Because that makes a difference. For electricity, how long can you wait to get your power restored if you're at the end of a long radio line in Marlborough somewhere, because that does drive cost and it does create a trade-off. And I think once it comes to trade-offs, you probably want somebody involved who understands the dollars and the price impacts as well as kind of the quality impacts.
So Colin, Mike and Rebecca, you're the regulated entities. What's your perspective, if any? Or are you going to keep your powder dry? Should we bundle the technical side of regulation, drinking water, environmental with economic, or should they be separate?
I'm happy to go first, because I live that every day. So we just context, We have I say min 4 regulators, we probably have more than that with safety regulator, etc. So the way, so we have an economic regulator, building blocks, exactly as explained, very clearly explained earlier. We have a drinking water regulator, we have an environmental regulator, I have a dam safety regulator, and then there's a few others that just sit off the side. It depends on what you mean by bundling, I suppose. From my perspective and the way the legislation is set up, they're all independent. But the issue becomes, and that's how they've operated for the 5 years or 4 years. 4 years of our 5 years, they operated almost entirely independently, and that did produce problems, I have to say. And this is one of the changes we have worked with the regulators to produce. So, from a risk profile perspective, you can't do everything at once when you're reforming the industry. So what matters the most? You go to customers, you go to government, it's really bleedingly obvious. Marcus will probably be pleased to hear drinking water, but drinking water quality, not drinking water reliability, drinking water quality. Then you get environment, then you get dam safety, then environmental last, service standards. And our issue was, we focused on drinking water first. In our reforms, drinking water quality, number one by a country mile. Most of that money that I talked about that's been invested has actually been invested in drinking water. Why? Because people die. Quite simply, and you can have a massive impact. The issue was the environmental regulator, the dam safety regulator, the economic regulator to some degree, who's done a whole bunch of benchmarking based on poor data we provided, I might add, are saying, why is our stuff not getting done? So we end up absolutely sandwiched, the government's not involved, so we're trying to deal with this whole situation. In the end, this is one of the lessons I learned from the UK. I came back and I thought, you've got to have a long-term plan. We've all got to know where we're going. People have got to accept trade-offs. And so what we did to address it, no, they're all independent still. They're not all bundled up, but we have a quarterly meeting where it's made quite clear to the environmental regulator, there's your path for improvement over the next 10 years. There's the path, it's plotted for drinking water. Right, and we meet once a quarter, we discuss the challenges with that, we all know what matters most, and we know where the funding's going. And I mean, that doesn't take away from the equivalent of Marcus absolutely hammering me when we don't get it right, but at least we know what our priorities are. And I found that is working okay.
May I just add to that? Sorry.
Okay.
I don't want anybody to get the impression that we sort of, get on our horse and, ride around like cowboys and we don't listen to the other regulators. That would be a wrong impression at all, completely the wrong impression. We do speak to the financial regulator, we do speak to the Environment Agency, and we do make sure and take heed of what they're saying. The way we do it, particularly with the financial regulators, is they quite rightly have to have serviceability standards. It's important that financial regulator is done in the exact way that you talk about. And what we do as the water quality regulator is rather than let the financial regulator fumble about trying to figure out what the serviceability standard should be for water quality, because they were doing that. And 3 years ago I thought, well, we can't have this. What we've got to do is just, we've got to help them have the right standards for water quality. So in my last slide I talked about advanced regulatory techniques, and I didn't really have the time to explain what those were all about. Well, those advanced regulatory techniques were things that we have developed in the last 3 years, and we have given them to the financial regulator so that they can put the serviceability standard against what really matters. So they're hammering Anglian water for metaldehyde, Thames water for lead, and Severn Trent for turbidity, rather than hammering them on iron, manganese and aluminium and networks, and they're going around pushing the network, trying to meet compliance. But I would say that that's a very mature and developed regulatory system, and you need to think hard about applying such an advanced regulatory system to a system or a current system which needs some way to go. along the strategic pathway, I would say, which is much the same as you've been saying.
Thanks, Marcus. Down here.
Nick Zammit, Gisborne District Council. Question to Marcus, really. We've heard of some eye-watering amounts in terms of the fines that you get. Heard some huge amounts of fines. Where does that money actually go to in terms of those fines?
Okay, so the figures that I was talking about weren't fines. So the £85 million was the cost that the company had to spend to deal with the disaster that they had befallen them. So what happened, just to give you a brief understanding of what happened, is that there was a leakage in a large trunk main, which was leaving the works, and the company had decided that they needed to fix that leak. Now, to fix that leak, they needed to depressurise that main. It just so happened that that main had the motor water, the process water that comes ex-works back into the works to mix with the chemicals that are used for treatment. Now, to do that, what they then decided to do is, okay, well, we're cutting that off because we're depressurising the main, so we're going to get the water from somewhere else. So they got the water from the nearest service reservoir to the treatment works. Now, if anybody's decided to look at my soporific works, I've always said that once you put water out into the network, you have a risk. You have an additional risk. You have an additional risk for the service reservoir and the networks, because unfortunately they leak. Unfortunately, the reservoirs allow water in. Sometimes they're living structures, they move, and they need to be assessed over a period of time. So without taking a risk assessment, they brought that water back from the reservoir. That reservoir was leaking, and in that contained some Cryptosporidium oocysts. So they inoculated their treatment works by doing that without doing an appropriate risk assessment, and that inoculated the secondary filters. It went through the secondary filters, and if you know anything about Cryptosporidium filters, it eventually finds its way through, and the wash water was then going back to the top of the works. Now, Badenoch and Boucher says, beware of reservoirs because they're a risk for Cryptosporidium. They said, we say you've got to risk assess before you do a change of practice in the treatment. And once you realise you've got Cryptosporidium, because they knew it straight away because they were sampling, you should then return that to the head works. Then they reseeded the primary filters. So what happened was that because the main was so big, 33 inches, they didn't have a UV light. We'd served a notice on them overnight, because that's what we do with friendly people like that. There's a risk to health, here's a notice, get it sorted overnight. Now they'd realised that they didn't have a UV light big enough, because they don't come that big off the shelf. And so what they had to do is they had to put a UV light on the exit of every reservoir, because I don't know if you know the bucket of mud principle. If you put mud in the bottom of a bucket and you turn it on, you can't get the mud out. Okay, so they couldn't put the UV on the beginning of the reservoir, because now the reservoirs were seeded. It was a positive loop, so they had to put it on the outside of all the reservoirs. That means they had to buy and hire all the UV from everywhere, from the United States across Europe and everywhere, dig holes that were 5 metres deep and install them. And they had to do it within 10 days, because I was so amenable to allow them more than that long anyway. Anyway, they put all of these UV lights in. So the cost of the money they had to give back to the consumers in compensation, the money it cost them to hire and buy UV light, the money it cost them to dig it out was the £85 million. The fine was only £500,000. Okay, it was quite small, but the reputational loss to that company was severe. And had the board thought, just for a moment, that they were going to spend £85 million, they wouldn't have done that. Okay, they would have done something different. Now, it's easy for me to look back and say, well, look, you should have done that. But actually, when we spoke and we put our case to the court agreed with us. The court agreed that the company didn't take the basic risk assessment. Now, because they had continuous monitoring, what they did is they immediately put the boil water notice on. They did the right thing at the end of the day, at whatever cost they put the boil water notice on. And that's ultimately why you would think that nobody was ill. So it wasn't 85 minutes, I used 85 minutes as look, this is the total cost, or 86 minutes if you add the fines, and our costs actually, because we charged them back. Now the economic regulator won't put that onto bills, and they don't put it onto bills. It costs out of their pocket.
Okay, I'll go Clive and David.
Thank you. Sorry, Mr. Son. Yeah, the focus on the water regulator in some ways is the easy bit of it. In New Zealand, we've got the water that's obviously a public health issue. We also have sewage, we have stormwater, and we have the freshwater debate. And the thing that wasn't even mentioned by the Minister this morning was the cultural aspect of it. So for instance, in stormwater treatment, you can go 3 times the cost if you don't mix catchments, if you don't discharge to...
So your question is there, Clive?
How can you use a regulator for water that addresses all the other priorities that we're faced with in New Zealand at the moment?
Is that for Marcus or everybody?
It's generally.
Okay. What do you comment?
Marcus has been talking a lot. My view would be that you keep focus. So drinking water regulation should be drinking water regulation. And all the other aspects, either they get covered by RMA or something. I think in New Zealand we're always challenged by the fact that our resources are diluted, so we want to bundle them, which is something I didn't talk about when I said I was going to talk about why I think stormwater should be out of water and wastewater. It's the same thing. If we have drinking water regulations, well, put it in the Ministry of Health, because it's closest. And that's simply because we are short of resources, and we think if you put it there somehow they'll find the resources. The reality is resources don't get found. So you need to be putting in very focused groups who know exactly what their job is, and that is the only way we're going to move forward, especially where we are and where we need to be.
Coming from the rest of the panel, if any?
The only thing I was going to add to that is when I look at the national bottom line for freshwater quality and where we've got to measuring some of our catchments, it just really helps to have a stake in the ground. And when you've got a stake in the ground, you know what you have to do and you're trying to fix it. Without it, or other words, without a level of regulation, then you spend so much time trying to work out what the level of service standard should be in the longer term. It just doesn't make any sense to me. It's much better to have a target that everyone agrees nationally and then work out how to get there.
Thanks, Clive. David?
Yes, sorry, can I just... Sorry. I think, to answer your specific question, though, is how can you use a regulator to solve these problems? I think the short answer is a regulator doesn't solve these problems, the industry solves these problems. What the regulator does is it gives the industry an ability to verify and to strengthen and communicate its story. But ultimately, the industry has to take the lead and explain what its story is, how it wants to solve these problems, and then have the regulator say, I've looked at it, it makes sense, or I've looked at it, most of it makes sense, but I think some of it doesn't, and we work together. But at the end of it, you have a story that's an industry story saying, this is how I'm going to solve important problems, this is why they're important problems, this is why they're the right solutions. And the way you use the regulator, or the role of the regulator, is to say, yes, absolutely, where we've gotten to is the right way to go. But they can't generate those ideas, they're there to verify them.
Thanks, David.
Yeah, another question for Marcus. A couple of times in your presentation you talked about taste and odour. I think that's right. So does your ambit include taste and odour as well as the sort of the hardcore health things? Because that's quite a grey area. I'm just wondering how you manage that.
Yes, we do, and there is a standard of taste and odour in our regulations, and taste and odour is one which should be acceptable to the consumer because it is all about acceptability. As soon as the consumer starts to reject the water on acceptability, then actually you're defeating the point because they're not drinking it. What you want to do is get them to drink it. And acceptability can be really quite a diffuse thing, and it can even be as simple as just changing the source of water, where people notice the difference and they stop drinking it. So we do look at acceptability. We do work together with our companies that we regulate, to ensure that there is that acceptability meets the requirements of the consumers.
Hi. let's say the,
Oh, sorry, no, I've got you on my list. I've been very, very democratic. Down to the gentleman with the buttons.
Marcus, I've got a question for you. What funds you're inspecting? Do you levy your service providers? Have you got the sustainable funds to do your job properly?
Okay, that's quite a good question actually, and we have gone through a change over the last 5 or so years. We were publicly funded, and the strategy of the government is regulation should cost recover. So we do some work which is directly for government, i.e. policy work in terms of writing and editing the regulations, representing the UK in Europe, being a collaborating centre for WHO and so on, which we charge the government for. It's a very small part of our budget, about 1/5 of it. The rest of it we charge back to those we regulate. So every time we go and visit them to audit, we charge them for audits, we charge them for any event that we investigate, all the compliance, programs of work, etc. And that's really a fair way, because those who are breaching the regulation are visited by us most and pay the most, and those that are compliant pay the least. So it's almost an financial incentivisation for companies to get it right. And I could talk all day about how we do that, but I won't. But we do use better regulation as a mechanism to understand where we go, how much time we spend with companies, and what we look at. And in fact, we're part of, or I'm part of, the international a group for delivery of regulation, and there'll be a book out, I understand, by one of the government departments on how we work, how we regulate, and how we do better regulation. So maybe I'll pass that on.
Jim Graham, Water New Zealand. And I don't want to presuppose any particular outcome with this question, but my question is for Mike and for Marcus, and it's this. What happens to councils or local authorities or municipalities, whatever you like to call them, when responsibility for the provision of water and wastewater services is removed from them? In your experience, you've both seen it. What's the impact on those organisations in the short term and the long term when that big change occurs and those utilities, responsibility for those utilities are removed from them?
So you're asking that of Marcus from a UK perspective, and then Mike from a Tasmanian experience?
Yes.
Correct, okay. If you can, Marcus.
Okay, I mean, the legislation's quite clear. The local authorities don't divest themselves of the responsibility of health in their local area. And if there is, for instance, an event or an issue with water, they are supposed to be informed about it, should be informed about it, respond to an emergency if necessary, and keep a general understanding, but they aren't specifically responsible for running the water companies or doing that aspect of it. We do split our regulation in terms of public supply and private supply. Private supply are those which perhaps have a borehole for the hotel or a cafe or a B&B and so on. And the local authorities regulate that. That's based upon the fact that's a lower risk in terms of the number of people. Everybody's important, but it's a lower risk. So they have a regulatory input for that, and we supervise that in terms of the local authorities. So local authorities still have a big say, which when we meet companies and we have our liaison meetings, we have the health boards there, the local authorities there, the water companies there, we do talk to all stakeholders. They don't disappear from the picture, but there's a recognition that the local authorities are really pressed for cash, they're really pressed for expertise, and they're really pressed for time. And a lot of the local authorities we find are only too glad to have someone turn up who knows that particular sector well and work and advise them to meet their regulatory duties.
Mike, Tasmania?
I'll probably split the question into finance and regulatory. So when our reform first started, councils were expected to reduce their rates by the amount of revenue they were receiving for water, providing water and sewage services or sewage services. In reality, what happened was some managed to maintain their rates, and then water bills came in, and so those councils suffered reputationally. Some did the right thing and were, I'm trying to be careful with choosing my words, but it could be argued some were milking the revenue from water and sewage and under-investing. And when and yet they did the right thing and let their rates drop to reflect the amount they were receiving, and then their council suddenly suffered significant financial distress, and some of them still suffer that today. So what was done was we calculated, or not we, or the government of the day, and then calculated what was called a developed priority distribution. So I won't bore you with all the detail, but in effect to try and largely true up most of them. It was not, as I said earlier, not entirely perfect, because you'll never get to the bottom of who really did the right thing and the wrong thing. Over time, what has now happened, the councils in effect get an annuity stream from us. One of the good things about council ownership is they're actually focused on the community. They're not focused on maximising profit, they actually just want a steady revenue stream. And that's what they get, in effect. They don't get masses, that the returns are very, very low, return on assets to councils, but that helps them fund other road programs, other infrastructure programs. They also, through the reform, lost access to a lot of federal funding, which has been very difficult. So when Taswater comes along, big company, you've got control of this big company now, you're getting revenues, we're no longer going to let you have federal funding. So that was the problem. So that's the economic story. At this point in time, I think councils are pretty happy. And that's why they fought for a year against the state government taking over. They actually fought the 29 of them to keep it in local government hands. From a regulatory perspective, the change has been, they are still regulators. They regulate what we call level 2 sewage plants. We work very closely with the councils. The relationship between Taswater and councils is very good. I think because two factors. One, they are our owners, like any shareholder, you want to keep your shareholder happy. Two, the chairman and myself have really focused on the importance of the relationship, because remember that local communities, in our experience, the relationship is generally very, very strong with the council. And we tap into that, and we know we need each other. So that would be my...
Thanks, Mike.
Dominic Muguzo from Canberra Council. My question is for Ravin and Colin. They lead big organizations with healthy balance sheets, and they have also expressed that they attract high caliber talent. So my question is, in terms of human capital investment, how well are you doing in human capital investment? Because let's say that we go to the model where we have regionalized water suppliers. The problem of human capital will not depart just because we have regionalized. Okay. So that's my question for Ravin and Colin.
Ravin, you want to go first? Capacity and capability.
Yes, so if I use the example of Watercare, the integration in 2010, we reduced the number of staff. So you will find that initially the type of work that is being done will change. But so our numbers went down and they've gone up again. So we would have fewer planners, fewer engineers. But then now, because we're going into more, the digital and customer service angle, we're putting more staff in. So initially, you will find that where there are shortages in New Zealand, those gaps will get filled in by those where the resources exist. Where there's an excess of resource in whatever area, they will get, they'll become victims. So it's the same as, what is happening with AI. So predictable work, transactional work, where large volumes are getting done in segregated groups at the moment, they'll get centralized and you won't need as many people. But there will be certain functions where we will need more people. So there will be that change that will happen, if that answers your question.
Colin?
Yeah, I'd love to have the big fat balance sheet that Ravine has, but look, I think that my answer would be that we're going to create value in the three water space. We have to have the expertise, the capability around New Zealand. Now, I'm not answering this from a Wellington point of view. It seems to me across the country, with the challenges we have got in front of us, we've got to have the capability to deal with that. And from our point of view, we're relatively immature in terms of just starting up over the last 3 years. And it's been an education process, I reckon, around some of our councils and others around the value capability generates for you, particularly around the long term. And so focusing on that as opposed to just short-term cost measures is, I think that's where you've got to start when you're trying to get your water business up and running.
Hi, Bill Staley, Haringey District Council. I'm just talking about unintended consequences. We're a smaller rural council with 6,500 ratepayers and water infrastructure the same size as Hamilton City. About 60 to 70% of our water and our restricted supply goes to farmers. Our big worry is those farmers will go on to their own supply for stock water and we'll lose our base of suppliers. So our small towns will have only a small rate base and the whole scheme could fall over. Is there any answers for me?
Very impressive comment.
Yeah, well, I think it would be case specific, but I think you've got a very long water main, right? 38, 40 kilometres from your source, and along the way you've got farmers who take the raw water off. So without knowing the specifics, I would say in a situation like that, I'd put the treatment plant closer to the urban area and have a raw water main which is going to your farmers because they don't need treated water. And then you put your treatment and have your urban communities getting the treated water for drinking. But I think it would be, there will be stranded costs. So generally, and when I was at Manukau Water at Manukau City, we took Manukau Water Limited out of Manukau City. It left a big stranded cost with the council. And Manukau City is a big council relative to many of the councils in New Zealand. So the challenge of what happens when you take water and wastewater out of a council, and it makes between 25 and 30% of your cost or your revenue, there will be stranded costs, and that will have to be addressed somehow. So the challenge will be there, and that's part of the challenge. How do we address that? And is it that the water and wastewater companies will pay a dividend, which is what's happening in Australia. So in Australia, the water companies are paying a dividend to their council shareholders, right, Mike?
Yes.
Yep. Well, I'm not paying a dividend. That's because of legislation. But if I were paying a dividend to Auckland Council, a lot of that money would go to my poor cousin for stormwater. And it would fix up a lot of the stormwater problems. So there are other, we need to have this conversation and the discussion to put the right model in. If we get too pure about, well, the money could be, this would be council raping and pillaging the consumers, well, that's why you have a regulator. So if you put all the building blocks in, then the model will work.
Thanks, Ray. That was it.
Eric Westergaard from Advisium. We've talked a little bit today about the economic regulatory model. We've talked about, for want of a better term, the technical side, the water quality and those sorts of issues. And when you look at New Zealand, one could argue that we've got those regimes in place already, so we don't actually need to do anything. the issue then comes down to how do we encourage the incumbent water providers to actually improve their performance, which would come back to giving the authority to the relevant regulatory bodies to actually do their damn job. And then the local authorities and others would then rationalise because they determine that actually this is not a business that we should be in. We don't have the core skill sets to deliver what we should be delivering, and therefore we go and talk to Ravine, we go and talk to Colin, or we do something in terms of forming a joint venture. So my question to the panel is, are there actually simpler ways about resolving this problem in the New Zealand context than the pain that it appears that we're going to be putting ourselves through over the next several years?
Look, like everyone, I've seen one model personally, understand that model, the pros and cons of that. Seen the UK, and everyone's different, but it's just about getting your incentives right up front, to be frank, and how much pain are you prepared to trade off and pay to get your objectives. Where I see things go wrong is loose objectives, not stated up front. So you end up with a wrong model or a halfway house. You don't address some of the core issues. The last gentleman, the question is absolutely a fundamental issue that we still face, I might add, because I don't think it was well thought through up front. Recycled water, irrigation water is still a problem in Tasmania. It's the last of what I consider to be the big strategic challenges that we're now getting on the tackling, which has resulted in some difficult stranded assets for that example. So my response to you is focus less right now on the form of economic regulation. Be clear on what you want and what you're prepared to pay for it. And I'm not just talking about dollars, I'm saying be very clear on what those trade-offs are. What is negotiable, what is not, and listen to the shareholders. I don't think in Tasmania we did enough. Sorry, the shareholders, listen to the key stakeholders, because I don't think we understood, I know we didn't understand a lot of the impacts of what was coming. And the last thing I'd say, going back to what I said earlier, I'd say go and learn from others. It's a well-trodden path, or at least when you're making a choice, you're informed. That would be my advice.
Okay, I've got quite a list of questions, so if I could ask the panel to start being snappy with the answers.
So just very briefly, I guess, in response to the last question or before that, I think, there's always an issue of scale with infrastructure. I think often people assume that rationalisation means rationalisation of ownership. And it often can be, but it doesn't need to be. So a model that has been used successfully in the US with, they tend to be not local authorities, but they tend to be consumer cooperatives that own lots of small electricity utilities, is they rationalise the operations and management, but they retain the ownership. So the individual cooperatives still set the direction and they say, this is what's important to us and this is what isn't. But there's a large kind of operations and maintenance and capital plan that sits across 20, 30, 40 of these things, develops the plans, and then procures it all together, operates it all together, and keeps the costs largely within the same scale that a large utility would, without diluting the very important community ownership part of it. And in fact, that example was what was used to get the New Zealand customer-owned businesses and electricity out of regulation, was to say they can follow that model, and in fact that's what they've been increasingly doing in the last 10 years.
Just to add to that though, I think there's two parts I'd like to say. One is that I think having clear standards into the future to know what you're aiming for helps a lot. But I agree, sometimes just chatting about with your neighbours and understanding what you're about and what you want to achieve. There could be a lot more chat going on around this issue across owners, I believe.
Kia ora, Ellen Morgan from Otago Regional Council, and somewhat follows on from the question before around stranded assets, but we've talked a lot today about big systems, big costly systems that are costing out into the future. And I want to bring it back to the fact that we're aiming to get good drinking standards. I'm from the Queenstown Lakes, and for the amount of water that actually reaches the houses that go into drinking water, it's only a very small amount. And there are, ongoing technological advances that might provide for much more small-scale treating of that water and getting good water quality. So I guess the question is, how can councils provide for that flexibility into the future, particularly for our smallest communities, so that we don't end up with assets that are over and beyond what's actually required? Are there any good examples that you can talk of?
In the archery, we used to call that gold plating. How do you stop that?
So in Auckland, we have a coastal community in Beachlands, in Maraetai. They don't have town supply. They've got rainwater tanks. And we've said we won't be bringing town supply. Firstly, because we can't force people to connect. So we'll put the investment in, people have already invested in their rainwater tanks and they won't connect. And we've got thousands of customers who are right next to our water mains who have not connected because they've got rainwater tanks. So we're quite happy. If they're happy with their rainwater tanks, we're happy.
Look, this has been pretty vexing in Tasmania. We've probably come to the back end of it. Pretty much similar to what Raveen said. In some ways, that's the easy bit. The communities that are happy to accept what we would call alternative solutions, that's not that hard to achieve. People who've never had reticulated drinking water have already invested in tanks, exactly as Raveen said. They're probably going to say, we don't ever want to see your bill, thank you. And quite frankly, if it's 50-50, don't even go there because you'll split your community. So we have a rule, it has to be 80%. Yeah, but the challenge is when you've got an existing system, people have had reticulated water, then they expect it to be fixed. And I can tell you, I've been through it the hard way. We went through the, we'll put them on tanks model. I had a hearse once show up in front of one of my community meetings when I went to put them on tanks. Literally parked out the front trying to give me a message.
Successfully not the same.
Yeah, so, I've had some interesting community engagement meetings. I think what you've got to understand is if they've currently got drinking water coming to their house, you're going to be fixing it. There'll be very few towns that will say, yep, 80% of us agree we're going to lose our service and have a tank. Those that don't have it now, yeah, you'll be fine. And that is going to be a difficult debate for you if you have a similar arrangement to what we have. We had many towns, probably 40 of them, I would say probably 40 towns have been on permanent boil water alerts across the reforms.
Thanks, Mike. Yes, sir.
Okay, good afternoon. John Mack is my name from Christchurch City Council. It wouldn't be right to have a day like this without a comment from Christchurch. Just for our overseas visitors, thanks for coming along today. Really do appreciate you taking the time and the effort to come here. So while we've got you here, just a quick explanation about Christchurch. It's the largest city in New Zealand that has an untreated water supply. We have 370,000 customers. Most of that is from bore water, which is untreated. Of course, in response to the Havelock North inquiry in August 2016, I recommended to Council that we accelerate the bore program to go to deeper aquifers and to chlorinate in the meantime. They accepted the plan to accelerate the bore program, but said no thank you to chlorination. Christchurch are quite staunch about not having chlorine in their water. But following the Havelock North's second report in December last year, we have then taken the advice of the Medical Officer of Health to chlorinate the supply until such time as we can get sign-off from the drinking water assessor. So there's a real focus by the people, by the Christchurch City Council. Their focus tends to be to get the chlorine out of the water ahead of the goal of preserving public health. Now, I wouldn't mind your advice, what I could take back, and this is really for sort of Marcus and Mike. So what advice would you give me to take back to the councillors in Christchurch about the priority of getting chlorine out of the water and or removing a barrier that's actually doing quite a good job right now? But there is an issue of taste and odour, and so how do you weigh that up against the preservation of health?
Thank you. So Marcus and Mike,
Yeah, that's quite a difficult question when you kind of think about it. I mean, the perspective I would always come from is, as I've said before, public health comes first. I think you'd have to understand what the risks are associated with your system. If there are risks, and unfortunately we'd love a risk-free life, there will always be risks. It's understanding what barriers you should have, and I would usually say that you should have a multiple barrier system, because having one mitigation will go wrong at some point. So I would suggest you go back, you risk assess your source, you work out what the appropriate mitigations are and have the appropriate treatment in for that. And if it is chlorine, as well as other barriers, then that's a discussion that you would have to have. I understand about the taste and odour aspect of chlorine. It's one of the biggest complaints that we have in England. We do have a chlorinated supply, and when people move from one area to another, or they move from one supply increases the chlorine just a tiny bit, people notice it. People are exquisitely sensitive to chlorine. You can advise people to say, well, you feel that given the risks that you have a necessary mitigation, you have to have chlorination, in which case you would advise either pop it into a jug and pop it in the fridge, or if you really don't like it, you can use a jug filter, which has a carbon pack in it, but don't forget to change the filter, because people often change the filter. But I would advocate working out the risks, putting a multiple barrier approach, and sometimes taking the unpopular decision.
Mike, briefly, I've got 3 questions to get through, and then I'll draw it to
I'll be really blunt. I've had this. No, they will be getting chlorine. Don't be silly. Quite frankly, UV will probably, we think of it like a seatbelt. And multi-barrier, absolutely right, no Newcastle, but fundamentally, starting point, UV is great, but it only protects you when you leave the plant. You've got your network, it can be long, it cannot be known. You've got to have some other protection. So I had the same thing and said, thank you very much. There are not many things I don't negotiate on, but this is one of them.
Hey, sorry, I'm just going to add one thing. After chlorinating 100,000 people last year and they've never had it before, in addition to that is you have to understand there's a sense of loss, and you've got to deal with that at a personal level. If you just take it as a technical answer and not see it as an adaptive challenge around the community, you're just going to buy a massive fire.
Just wanting to ask about Christine Nolan, Ministry of Health. Just wanting to ask about the alliance relationship that Mike Rooster referred to in your presentation in the Tasmanian model. You noted alliance relationships at the end of your presentation.
I've got 2 more questions, so briefly, guys.
Well, the primary alliance I'm talking about is an alliance to deliver our capital program. So, because we have to accelerate quickly, and also I think there are commercial benefits for our customers from having a commercial organisation, we are setting up an alliance between with our employees and a private entity to deliver our capital program over the next 5 years.
Noel Roberts, Second Man in Water New Zealand. You don't have that cringy, Colin. But the question is to Colin, Mike and Raveen. On the flip side of John's discussion, on that Steve Ferretti's 6 principles for water treatment, one of them is that the decision-making process of those that are in the water industry understand the risks of the water industry all the way through. So how do your 3 organisations cope with that, have front of mind the risks to water supply compared to a normal council entity?
I understand the question, how are we applying the 6 principles from the Havelock North inquiry, you're saying?
Yes, especially one on the risks.
Right. Well, obviously I've got the microphone. So I think the tricky one for us, I think I'll leave others to answer the risk one, but there's 2 cultural questions in the 6 principles. One's around treating it as a public health entity and how they're really owning the safety of your water. And from our point of view, we're just an exploratory basis of opening up a dialogue around that and understanding, what does it really mean to apply a cultural response to those 6 principles? Because we feel the technical ones are dealt really well, but it's trying to get their heads around, and I guess New Zealanders' heads around that it's a public health issue, and how do you do that?
I have to say that we, in Watercare, we have been dealing with risk management as a tool for the organisation for many years. And we don't see drinking water risk and health and safety risk and financial risk and political risk separately. So that's always a danger that we end up with treating these things as isolated. So my answer may seem flippant, but it's like, well, it's integrated in the way we do our business. So it hasn't, I mean, it wasn't a surprise. And that's what we do. It's in our DNA.
So it's just on 5 o'clock, there's one question, and because I'm up here, I get the question. And, there's got to be some first, ladies and gentlemen. The question I've got is the one that hasn't been asked yet, but was in the room. It started with the inquiry, and then the Minister put maps up on the thing this morning. So I've got a question for each of the panellists, and it's going to be one of 3 answers. Yes, no, or I'm kicking for touch. Do we need water service aggregation delivery in New Zealand? Anton? But by 3 options. And if you, the point being, we're going to have drinks and then you can tease out the answers later.
Repeat the question.
Sorry.
Repeat the question.
Should we have water aggregation of water service delivery companies along the lines the Minister sort of indicated could be on the table? That is, large companies, bottom North Island, 2 in the South Island, Auckland North, Waikato, Bay of Plenty, Taranaki, I think was from memory.
So I wasn't here for the morning, but in terms of operation and capital planning, yes. As to whether it's an ownership on the fence, or operation and amalgamation, I think you have to go there long term.
Thanks, I'm Colin.
My only answer is you've got to establish critical masses in big urban areas to be able to take the challenges on.
Right.
Well, I'm going to kick it into touch because I'm not a New Zealander and I don't know enough about the situation.
Yeah, but you can Thanks, Mike. Right?
That's what Australians do anyway. I'll put them together. Yes, no, I think we need to aggregate, but how and I'm with Anton.
Okay, and Marcus.
Each of my answer. Having said that, all I can't comment on the specifics about New Zealand, but what I would say in my experience, and certainly in Europe, aggregation often is what happens.
Okay. Thank you, Marcus. Now, ladies and gentlemen, it is 5 o'clock, and that brings the first day to a close.